set theory and logic.
Are there things that man can never know? I'm going to be concerned less with giving a straight answer to this question than with examining the question and ringing changes on it. Some variants of the question admit of obvious, uninteresting answers. Obviously, there are things that man will never know. Man will never know how many cars will have entered your city between now and midnight tonight. He will never know and never care. But he could know this number if he cared enough and had the foresight to make arrangements for keeping count of the cars. The serious question, rather, is whether there are things that man could never know, however foresighted he might be in setting out observers and cameras and tape recorders and Geiger counters and other detectors. Well, we've touched up our question a little in its auxiliary verb. We're asking if there are things that man could never know. Next, the noun needs some attention. Things. We talk of knowing things. What sort of things? Stones, trees, birds, bees? No. Things is a lame word in this connection. When we ask whether there are things that man could never know, we're really asking whether there are questions that man could never answer. It's not a question of things, it's a question of questions. It's a question of questions, so it depends partly on language. To suppose there are things we can never know is to suppose, more precisely, that there are questions that we can ask in our language, but that we could never answer. Now, our language is a very rich language, and perhaps it is capable of supplying questions that man could never answer. But before we try to settle that issue regarding our language, we will do well to gain some perspective by standing off and viewing a simpler situation, the situation of a poverty-stricken language. Imagine then that people who have never risen to the theoretical physics of hypothetical particles, or percent theory, or other abstract reaches of mathematics. Their language is adequate to the empirical mechanics of observable bodies, adequate to the laws of the lever and the pendulum, falling bodies, and the laws of motion. It's adequate also to reporting the concrete facts of human history, and adequate to what used to be called natural history, to describing the observable traits of plants and the observable behavior of animals. These people are a practical lot, not very imaginative perhaps, but as alert and observant as you please, and pretty knowledgeable in their down-to-earth sort of way. And within their language, are there any questions that man could not answer? In a rather uninteresting sense, someone might argue still that there are such questions. It's a legalistic point having to do with generalizations. Let's take the general statement, all men are mortal. There's a big logical difference between the question how many cars will enter your city between now and midnight and the question whether all men are mortal. We could, if we wished, arrange for a conclusive answer to the question of the cars, an answer based directly on observation. We could man all points of access. But we could never arrange for a similarly conclusive answer to the mortality question, based similarly on direct observation. Even if we cared so much about the answer that we were prepared to increase our observations by resorting to experimentation, which I find a rather lugubrious expedient in this instance, still there would be a difficulty in checking all instances. We could not check on ourselves and live to report an affirmative answer to the question. Other generalizations present somewhat similar difficulties, if less sanguinary ones. We felt we could answer the question, how many cars will enter before midnight, because of the feasibility of a stakeout. But if a general question covers indefinitely many cases, including cases too remote in the future to be observed by a living man, or too remote in the past to have been observed, then clearly it is a question that we cannot and sort of animal or the mechanics of rigid bodies will be a generality whose instances can be observed only by sampling and never exhausted. Must we then conclude that even in the limited language of our hypothetical practical tribe, there are questions that men could not answer? Yes, we must so conclude if we are going to be as stiff-necked as all this about what to count as answers. But we're demanding too much. We can know something in a reasonable sense of the word without having checked every instance by direct observation. If we've done a reasonable lot of sampling of instances, or if we have a plausible notion of an underlying mechanism that would account for the truth of the general statement in question, then we may reasonably be said to know the statement to be true. Sometime we may be surprised by a counter instance and compelled to conclude that we had not known the statement to be true after all. We only thought we did. This, however, is a risk we must run. So, let us relax our standard of what counts as the ability to answer a question. Belief, well grounded in observation, is what should count. But then, how firmly grounded should a belief be in order to count as answering a question? How shaky an answer should we allow? No general way is known of measuring the firmness of a scientific hypothesis, and if a way were known of measuring the firmness, still, how would we decide where to draw the line? Even in the limited language of our imagined tribe, it must be possible to ask questions about remote places and events, questions admitting only of the most tenuous answers after the ablest research. But this is uninteresting. It's not what one has in mind when he asks if there are things that man can never know. It's uninteresting because of the continuity. The questions about broad generalities or about remote places and events, and the questions about current local events differ only in degree. Some respond more generously to our investigations than others. I think it would be to no purpose to try to draw a line. When one asks if there are things that man can never know, he's really wondering whether some questions are unanswerable in principle. By this he means that no answer could gain any support whatever from even the ablest research. The question should also be somehow basically unlike the questions that we know how to find answers for. This further requirement is of course hard to formulate satisfactorily. Basic unlikeness is a vague idea. However, given some such strenuous standard of what to count as an unanswerable question, I think we can say of the imagined tribe that these people can raise no questions that man could not, in principle, hope to answer. Now let us take leave of the imaginary tribe and move nearer home. As we move nearer home, we move farther from observation. We move into a conceptual scheme of electrons, neutrinos, and other hypothetical particles that can never be directly observed. A conceptual scheme also of kinky four-dimensional space-time, mathematical abstractions, sets, relations, functions, integers, ratios, irrational numbers, imaginary numbers, and infinite numbers. None of these extras are observable. We already allowed our imaginary tribe a language that was adequate for recording images observable, and a good deal more. It was adequate also for expressing generalities about any matters that were individually interesting. What then is all this extra apparatus of ours? Is it sheer myth-making, unwarranted by observational evidence? Paradoxically, the purpose of all this extra apparatus is simplification. We are out to systematize and integrate the testimony of our senses by devising laws that relate the observable phenomena systematically to other observable phenomena. And the most systematic network of relations for this purpose turns out to be a network that links all these phenomena up with a lot of additional, unobserved, hypothetical entities that are only assumed for the purpose of integrating the system. The consequence is a rich theoretical language, rich enough, perhaps, to formulate questions that man could, in principle, never answer. For a while, let us assume that it is, so as to go on from that thought to some further ones. Afterward, I'll come back to that question. Very well, then. Granted that we, in our language, can formulate questions that man could, in principle, never answer, what are we to say of the imagined tribe that knows no such limits? We are simply to say, it would seem, that there were always these things that man could never know, but the imagined people were unable to formulate them because their language was too weak. On the other hand, it might be objected that in putting the matter thus, we are holding too parochially to the point of view of our own language. It might be objected that the low-level language was already adequate to all possible objective data, after all, and that the extra richness of our language was added only to facilitate the systematization of all possible data. It might thus be objected that when we say there are things that man could never know, when we say there are questions man could in principle never answer, we are merely pointing to an effect of our own artifact. This objection gained some support from a remarkable theorem of logic due to William Craig. Consider again our rich language of scientific theory and the low-level language of the imagined tribe. We may think of the low-level language as a part of the rich language. It's a part that stays closer to observable matters. The richness of the theoretical language serves the purpose I just now suggested of enabling us to formulate manageably simple laws relating observations to observations. But all we care about as output of the theory, let us suppose, is its empirical output. We care about those consequences, predictions for instance, that can be expressed in the low-level language. We formulate our observations in the low-level language, we combine them with theoretical laws somewhere up in the richer language, and from the combination we deduce consequences in the low-level language. There is takeoff, flight, and landing. Now what Craig shows is that the flight into theory is logically dispensable. He shows that if we can get anywhere by plane, so to speak, we can also get there by laboriously slogging through on the ground. He shows that if you have found a way of deducing a sentence of the low-level language from other low-level sentences, together with some theoretical truths, you can then also find a way of deducing that same sentence from those same other low-level sentences, together with some further, merely low-level truths. Craig shows explicitly how we can find such a ground route once we have the air. If the deduction of the sentence from other low-level sentences and the theoretical truths is written out explicitly in symbolic logic, he shows how to find some low-level truths that can be used in place of the theoretical ones. Craig's reasoning is quite general, yet does not depend on details of the low-level language and the theoretical language, nor on how we draw the line between them. Psychologically, granted, the flight into theory is indispensable. We would not find our way across the ground but for the aerial reconnaissance. On the ground, we cannot see the woods for the trees. Theory brings system. System is simplicity, and simplicity is psychologically imperative. Very well, our objector pursues, theory is our heuristic crutch. If I may descend from your soaring metaphor of flight to my limping metaphor of the crutch. So our rich language differs from the low-level language of the imagined tribe in having this heuristic crutch, this handy artifact. The objector concludes by repeating himself, saying once more that those purported questions that man could in principle never answer are merely an effect of his own artifact. Even our objector is bound to recognize that this heuristic aid has worked wonders. It has had man soaring, not limping. Man's power over nature is awesome, staggering. It's due to scientific theory, and it would have been humanly, psychologically impossible within the narrower language of the imagined triad. But this is by the way. I have given our objector his fair share of program time. He would like us to believe, I suppose, that the atom and elementary particles and the sets and numbers and functions are unreal, mere heuristic fictions. Is he right? If we are looking for questions that man could in principle never answer, perhaps we have a shining candidate right here. Are the hypothetical particles of physics and the abstract objects of mathematics real or mere heuristic fictions? It would seem indeed that man can never know. Everything observable, everything that could be available as evidence is expressible in the low-level language which shuns these controversial entities. Moreover, in view of Craig's theorem, all the inferential connections can in principle be held to that low level too. It's only to make the inferences easier that we venture higher. We might say of hypothetical particles and mathematical objects what Voltaire said of God, that if they hadn't existed, they would have had to be invented. Who is to say, then, whether they exist or were invented? Have we here reached the limits of knowledge, the unanswerable question? I think not. If we subscribe to our physical theory and our mathematics, as indeed we do, then we thereby accept these particles and these mathematical objects as real. It would be an empty gesture, meanwhile, to cross our fingers as if to indicate that what we are saying doesn't count. And if, rather than subscribing to our physical theory and mathematics, we were to adhere to the low-level language, then the question of the reality of the particles and the mathematical objects would simply not be there. It could not be phrased. We have to work within some conceptual scheme or other. We can switch schemes, but we cannot stand apart from all of them. It's meaningless, while working within a theory, to question the reality of its objects or the truth of its laws, unless in so doing we're thinking of abandoning the theory and adopting another. Let us then resume our accustomed stance at last within the evolving conceptual scheme that we take seriously. We are swarms of particles, swarms of medium density, making our filtered way through thinner swarms and moving erratically between other swarms as dense as or denser than ourselves. This, by our present lights, is how things are. We may learn better, but meanwhile we do what we can. Cozily ensconced, then, in these familiar old digs, let us consider again our original question about questions. Are there, from this point of view, things that man could never know? Are there questions man could, in principle, never answer? Possible cases in mathematics come to mind. There's something called the continuum hypothesis, having to do with the comparative sizes of certain infinite classes. Kurt Gödel and Paul J. Cohen have proved that this hypothesis can be neither proved nor disproved on the basis of the existing codifications of accepted mathematical laws. Still, this is not a clearly unanswerable question. For, remember the role of theoretical entities, mathematical and otherwise. They are extras that serve to fill in and smooth out and simplify the comprehensive world system by which, ultimately, we link phenomena to one another. Now, there may, in time, emerge new simplicity considerations, new plausibility considerations that can reasonably supplement our existing codifications of accepted mathematical laws. These added laws just might suffice in the end for proving or disproving the continuum hypothesis. A different sort of mathematical case that comes to mind is the celebrated theorem, due also to Gödel, to the effect that there can never be a complete formal proof procedure for what is called elementary number theory. This modest-seeming branch of mathematics treats of nothing more recondite than the positive integers. Yet Gödel has proved that any axiom system is bound to be inadequate to it. It is bound to leave some truths of elementary number theory unprovable. Any axiom system for it will be incomplete, and so will any other method of explicit proof. I'm having to leave my statement a bit vague, for otherwise the story is long. Now this is a remarkable and startling result. I haven't time to explain how startling or why, but does it point to unanswerable questions? It does not. No truths of elementary number theory are set apart by Gödel's theorem as unprovable. Rather, each axiom system or proof procedure will miss some of those truths. Other proof procedures can cover those or some of them and miss others. As I already suggested in connection with the continuum hypothesis, plausibility considerations can augment existing codifications of accepted mathematical laws. Gödel's theorem shows that such augmentation can never yield any one finished system in which every truth of elementary number theory is proved. But it does not show that any one truth of elementary number theory is forever inaccessible. Turning now to natural science, one thinks of Werner Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy. There's a strict limit to the accuracy with which man can know the position and velocity of elementary particles. The accuracy of position can be increased beyond a certain point only by sacrificing accuracy of velocity. Physicists tell us that this is a hard and fast limitation, a limitation in principle, not to be surmounted by any manner of observation and experiment. Man could, in principle, not answer the question of the position and velocity of the particle, except up to the prescribed band of tolerance. Here, then, is a really good example of the limits of knowledge. New discoveries might, of course, lead to revisions of physical theory and upset Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle. But even short of such an event, opinion is divided regarding the interpretation of the principle. Some hold that the particle has indeed its exact position and velocity, and that these are in principle inscrutable. Those physicists, then, acknowledge that we have here a straightforward example of the limits of knowledge. Other physicists hold that the particle simply has no exact position. This claim raises obvious logical difficulties, and some physicists have gone so far as to revise logical theory to accommodate them. One would hope for a less drastic remedy, but at any rate the motive is clear. There's a reluctance to assign meaning to strictly unanswerable questions. Questions, let us remember, are in language. Language is learned by people, from people, only in relation, ultimately, to observable circumstances of utterance. The relation of language to observation is often very devious, but observation is finally all there is for language to be anchored to. If a question could, in principle, never